real set rules for boys and girls, and I spent my entire childhood playing stickball in the streets. So I think that's just started me on saying, hey, and my parents let me be who I wanted to be. When I first ran for office in 1986, I was running, and my son Ben was about 8 years old, and he got interviewed by the Palm Beach Post, and they said to him, why should your mother get elected to the Florida House of Representatives? And the next day I read in the newspaper, my son said, my mom should be elected because she can't cook. I did teach my son to be an honest guy. So, you know what I want to do? I'm going to give you just a few examples of some of the experiences I had in public office. And first I wanted to say this. I found that when I went into the legislature, my son, who was 8 years old, was really the driving force behind so many of the things that I got involved in, because and as I looked in the legislature, did not have a lot of women. It was always a very small percentage. And somehow, what happens in politics, the men very wisely gravitate to the committees where they can raise a lot of money from lobbyists. And the women, we gravitate to the committees where we can help our families. And it's really true. At least in the old-fashioned days. So, and so when I got involved in child care issues, raising the standards of child care in the state, making sure women could have access to prenatal care. We had a very small women's caucus, and the women's caucus in the Florida House of Representatives and in the Senate there, we were responsible for the first very strong domestic violence legislation in the state. In fact, now you take it for granted that there is domestic violence and that we should not tolerate it. But when we, 25 years ago, we had to really convince our colleagues that domestic violence should be against the law. I mean, it wasn't even against the law. One day, one of the women in the legislature was a Republican. That was also very unique to be a Republican woman in the legislature. She came back from our hiatus, and she had just undergone breast cancer treatment. And she was complaining to us that she could not get in her insurance companies to cover her insurance to cover her mammograms. And so the women in the legislature, the Democrats and the Republicans, we banded together, and we were able to convince our colleagues, and we passed, this is many, many years ago, but we passed legislation that then required insurance companies to cover women's mammograms. Another very interesting experience, when I first started in the legislature, I got assigned to the healthcare committee. And usually what happens when you're a freshman, the Democrats were in the majority at the time, but I was a freshman. And so they usually give freshmen the assignments that nobody else wants. And I got assigned, this is now, picture back 1986. There was a disease that we were first reading about in the newspaper called AIDS, HIV/AIDS. I had never even heard of it before I went into the legislature. And I got assigned to chair the subcommittee on HIV/AIDS, which ended up to be an incredible experience for me. But the reason that they would entrust me, a freshman, to undertake this was because the men in the legislature at the time, what do you think? They were afraid of the association with HIV/AIDS. In fact, when I first took on the responsibility, I'd actually walk around and the colleagues would go like this, the AIDS lady. But we ended up passing Persistence Helps, and I actually had a wonderful doctor, Doc Myers, who was a Republican, and we passed an omnibus AIDS bill, which was the first bill in the country that with strategies to reduce the spread of AIDS, and so that worked out well. Probably, though, for me, most memorable, I had an opportunity to work with some of the most phenomenal women that I've ever met in my life. Names that may not ring a bell, but like Elaine Gordon and Elaine Bloom. Okay, one person remembers them. Oh, these were pioneers, absolutely pioneers for Miami. And in 1988 or 89, you may remember that the United States Supreme Court passed they had a decision which seemed to say that states could now change abortion rights. And so Governor Martinez called a special session to try to change the abortion laws here in Florida. And I'll never forget this, because it was basically the women of the legislature that stood up in force against these changes. And I'll tell you what, we had death threat. It was amazing. I mean, we had death threats. There were marches. It was crazy. People would send us. I'd get in the mail little coffins. You know, the little baby coffins. And but we stood strong. But that was in 1988. What does that tell you? Roe v. Wade was 1975, 1988. We thought, well, we're safe. We beat it. And then what I watched year after year, there was always legislation, just one step closer to trying to really stop women from being able to make their own personal health care choices. It started, well, we'll have a 24-hour waiting period. Oh, we'll have counseling. And it goes on until recently in the Florida House, they actually passed legislation that requires women, even women who have been raped, to have invasive, vaginal ultrasounds before they have access to abortion. That's what's going on in this country right now. Finally, one other thing I want to tell you, I think I was introduced as, I am actually the first and only woman in the history of the state to be the Democratic leader, minority leader. And you think about Democrats, you think, well, Democrats are maybe a little bit more democratic than Republicans, but here's why I think it happened. For many, many years in the Florida legislature, the Democrats were in control. When I first got into legislature, there were 80 Democrats, there were 40 Republicans in the Florida House. By the time I left, it was opposite. But midway through, the Republicans took over, and here's what happened. And I don't want anyone to, I hope this is not meant to disrespect any of my colleagues. I have wonderful male colleagues in the legislature. But they were so used to being in charge that when the majorities switched and now the Republicans were in charge, what happened was the folks who stood up to the plate to challenge the majority were the women. Because what we found is the women had never really been in power, and so we didn't feel like it would be a slight. It wasn't an embarrassment to us to step up to the plate. So I think that's how I got to be the minority leader. And finally I came back home to be the mayor of West Palm Beach, and I went from my advisors went from being high-priced lobbyists, who incidentally, lobbyists actually, most of them do very, very good jobs, to my advisors became the folks who I met in the grocery store. It's a very different atmosphere. But it was a great job, and I got an opportunity really I took out my big binder. I had a binder. And it was full of women. Actually, honored to appoint our first and only woman police chief here in West Palm Beach, and also we had women running departments from law to parks to purchasing, you name it. We had literally dozens of women in very high-ranking positions in the city, and I'll tell you what, I think they did a really great job. Have you been to West Palm Beach lately? Yay for them. And finally, my last and great act as the woman mayor was when I would, and this really, this is why the advantages of being a woman in office. In the old city hall, I'd go into the ladies' room, and there was always somebody in a stall, and then I'd hear this pump going. I'm going, hey, what's going on in there? And they say, I'm pumping my breast milk. So when we built our new city hall, I just want you to know, I put in a separate little lounge, privacy lounge, where the women who were nursing could go and pump their breast milk.